"There are no tables left tonight, ma'am," the hostess stated with a rehearsed smile, her tone edged with just enough finality to discourage further questions. She didn't glance up again, didn't ask for a name, didn't offer to check. Behind her, the dining area of the Violet Room gleamed softly in golden hues, polished wood floors, elegant white tablecloths, flickering candles. The kind of restaurant where anniversaries were celebrated, deals sealed, reputations built. And yet, tonight, its own founder stood invisible at the door. Celeste Vaughn, dressed in a simple navy wool coat with a leather planner tucked under one arm, didn't argue. She stood for a moment longer, taking in the low hum of diners and the sight of multiple empty tables near the front window. Then she gave a faint nod and stepped back into the cold. It had been years since Celeste had walked into one of her restaurants without warning, without an entourage or publicist, without the shield of CEO trailing her name like a title on a marquee. That was intentional. She believed you saw the truth of a place when no one knew you were watching. But what she witnessed tonight wasn't just a lapse in hospitality. It was the quiet, corrosive rot of something far more dangerous. Bias that wore a professional smile, discrimination delivered with practiced ease. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. She had arrived just after 7 p.m. Rain dusted her shoulders as she stepped out of the black car, thanking the driver and pulling her coat tighter. No reservation, no heads up, just Celeste, founder of the nationally renowned Haven Hospitality Group, mother of two, former corporate strategist, and a woman who still believed in building places where everyone felt welcome. The hostess didn't see that. What she saw was a middle-aged black woman standing alone. No obvious wealth, no designer handbag, no validation of belonging. She saw what her bias allowed her to see, and dismissed the rest. Celeste had built the Violet Room on values. It was the first restaurant she launched under Haven Hospitality, named after her late grandmother Violet, who once ran a kitchen out of a church basement in Birmingham, Alabama. It stood for elegance, excellence, and equity. Every staff training module included inclusivity, dignity, and implicit bias awareness. It was, ironically, the company's crown jewel for inclusive fine dining. And yet, here she was, denied a seat, denied even the dignity of being asked her name. The irony was almost poetic. As she walked toward the nearby cafe to warm up, her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. 10-year anniversary gala planning meeting Monday. A smile touched her lips. 10 years. A decade of late nights, funding rejections, press features, award speeches, and boardroom negotiations. 10 years of fighting to create spaces like this, only to be refused entry into one, quietly, politely, simply because someone had decided she didn't fit the scene. She remembered moments like this from earlier in her career, when she was a junior consultant in New York and had to carry two versions of her resume. When she'd been mistaken for an assistant at her own pitch meeting. When a hotel concierge had handed her a valet stub before even saying hello. These weren't the loud offenses of bigotry. They were the 1,000 paper cuts of prejudice dressed in civility. Moments like this were why she built her company in the first place. But that didn't make it sting any less. Inside the restaurant, no one knew. Laughter floated from a couple seated under the skylight. A waiter polished wine glasses behind the bar. The hostess greeted a pair of young white women in high heels and bright lipstick, smiling wider this time, gesturing toward the best corner booth. Celeste watched from across the street. This wasn't just about her. It was about the culture being cultivated without her knowledge. It was about the erosion of standards. It was about power being wielded by people too comfortable to realize they had any. Celeste pulled out her phone. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to post. She didn't need a confrontation, not yet. Instead, she sent a message. Short, precise. To her chief operating officer. Unannounced customer visit. Violet Room. Urgent. Call me in 10. She exhaled slowly and let the rain fall. In moments like this, many people would feel rage. Some would storm back in, demand apologies, make a scene. But Celeste Vaughn wasn't many people. She was the kind of leader who believed in measured change. The kind that didn't just correct behavior but transformed environments. This wasn't going to be a viral meltdown. This was going to be a reckoning. And the staff inside had no idea how close they were to the end of their shift. Rain misted across the windshield as Celeste sat in the back of a quiet cafe across the street. Her cup of chamomile untouched, cooling beside her. The window gave her a perfect view of the restaurant she had once dreamt about with childlike wonder. The Violet Room. Its name, etched in elegant script above the entrance, used to bring her a swell of pride. Tonight it brought something else. A weight, a reckoning. She didn't sit there feeling sorry. She sat there feeling responsible. Because Celeste Vaughn wasn't just a customer denied a table. She was the founder, architect, and visionary behind that entire establishment. Her fingerprints were on every detail, the curved arches at the bar, the custom-built mahogany wine wall, the local artwork lining the walls sourced from BIPOC creatives. Everything, down to the playlist looping in the background, had passed through her approval. And yet, somehow, she no longer fit into the very space she built. 10 years ago, the Violet Room had been just a sketch in her notebook. A dream forged during late-night shifts and exhausting conference calls. Back then, Celeste had been one of only 3 black women at her level in a global consulting firm. While others chased luxury branding gigs, she studied community economics, researched hospitality inclusion, and saved every spare dollar she could. Her grandmother, the restaurant's namesake, had once told her, "You don't change the world by shouting louder. You change it by feeding people, treating them right, and building places where they see themselves." That's what the Violet Room was supposed to be. Not just a restaurant, a declaration. Celeste hadn't built it to chase Michelin stars or impress investors. She built it to be a safe space disguised as fine dining. A place where elegance and equity could exist in the same room, where no one felt less than because of how they looked, how they dressed, or how much money they had. That was the founding principle. And that was what had just been spit on with a single sentence. No tables left. As her eyes watched guests flowing through the revolving door, she realized the most painful part wasn't the rejection. It was the betrayal of everything she stood for. The young hostess hadn't known who she was. The manager hadn't intervened. The staff had behaved as if they were the gatekeepers of exclusivity, not ambassadors of a mission. Somewhere along the way, her values had been replaced with vanity. And it hadn't started tonight. Celeste thought back to the last quarterly review. There had been a note from HR, minor uptick in employee attrition at the downtown location. A flag raised about inconsistent training. A review from a customer that simply said, "Great food, but felt like I didn't belong." She'd made a mental note to visit in person. Life had gotten in the way. Or maybe, deep down, she'd hoped it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But now there was no denying it. The values that had once guided this place had been diluted into performative policies, words on posters in the staff lounge, checklists during onboarding, not lived experience. The culture had slipped. And in hospitality, when culture slips, people fall through the cracks. Celeste knew this wasn't about one hostess or one manager. It was about rot creeping in through complacency. About who got promoted, who got listened to, who got quietly pushed out. Her silence now would make her complicit. She pulled out her phone again and opened the Haven Hospitality internal dashboard. Scrolling past revenue figures and seating charts, she tapped the Violet Room's employee roster. The faces filled her screen, some familiar, some new. She noticed something troubling. The diversity she once fought so hard to ensure had thinned. A sharp drop in Black, Latinx, and Indigenous hires compared to previous quarters. And at the managerial level, none at all. She felt her jaw tighten. It had happened under her nose. Not because she didn't care, but because she trusted too much. Delegated too far down. Success had made her generous with authority. Maybe even careless. But that ended tonight. Her hand hovered over the call button for her chief operating officer. She didn't press it yet. Instead, she leaned back and remembered the early days. The excitement of opening night. The first time a local journalist called it the future of American fine dining. The first customer who hugged her because they'd never been to a restaurant that felt like it was made for people like me. She remembered how hard it had been to fight for funding when most investors didn't think an upscale, black-owned hospitality brand had a market. How she'd been told to partner with a white face for visibility. How she refused. This place was built on defiance, on dignity, on a deep belief that the hospitality industry didn't need to choose between profit and principle. Now she had to defend it again. But her way was never to throw tantrums. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She raised expectations. Quietly, strategically, with consequences that echoed louder than any outburst ever could. As the rain tapered off and traffic glided past the glowing windows of the violet room, Celeste stood up. She zipped her coat, slid her planner into her tote, and walked to the curb. Her car pulled up, as if sensing the shift in her mood. The storm was no longer outside. It was walking through those restaurant doors. She didn't need to introduce herself. She would let the facts do that for her. Because tonight wasn't just about correcting bad behavior. It was about recentering the mission, reclaiming the space, and reminding every staff member under her banner that when you forget the why, the who will show up to remind you. The violet room was about to remember who it belonged to. Celeste didn't walk through the doors of the violet room with a storm behind her. She didn't slam her car door shut or stride in with fire in her eyes. That wasn't her style. Power, she'd long understood, didn't need to perform. It needed only to arrive. The doorman recognized her first, not as a customer, but as the founder. His posture stiffened, unsure whether to greet her or get out of her way. Celeste gave a silent nod, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She wasn't here for theatrics. She was here to reclaim what had quietly been stolen. Inside, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Dim lighting, gentle jazz spilling from the speakers, and the murmur of polite conversation. Guests lifted glasses, toasted birthdays, laughed over crème brûlée. The staff floated between tables with polished grace, carrying plates that looked like art. On the surface, it was still the violet room. But surface had never impressed Celeste. She moved toward the hostess stand with the precision of someone who knew every square inch of this space, because she'd built it from blueprints and memories, from meetings with architects and phone calls with her grandmother about what hospitality used to feel like. Each design decision had come from somewhere personal. And yet, the place no longer felt familiar. The hostess, Brielle, stood tall, her back straight, her face the same mask of blank courtesy as before. She didn't recognize Celeste. Again, there was something piercing in that. Not in the fact that Brielle didn't know her title, but that she didn't know her spirit. Celeste had always believed that when a space is built with intention, people feel it. They sense the energy of who it's made for. Brielle didn't feel anything. That was the problem. Before Celeste could speak, Jason, the general manager, stepped forward. He hadn't been alerted. There had been no warning from corporate, no calendar invite marked CEO visit. But something in the energy of the room had shifted, and he felt it instantly. He wore confidence like a tailored jacket, always snug, always presentable. But tonight it slipped, just slightly. He smiled, not the way people smile at someone they respect, but the way they smile when they're trying to calculate what you know and how much damage you can do with it. Celeste didn't bother introducing herself. She didn't need to. Jason knew. There was no raised voice, no announcement of her identity to the room. She didn't shout, didn't demand anyone get the manager, didn't declare anything at all. Her presence alone was a rupture, a quiet siren. They moved to the private vestibule near the wine cellar, a space she'd personally designed for intimate tastings and chef collaborations. Tonight, it became the war room. Jason talked first. Predictably, he started to explain something vague about confusion about the new hostess, about reservations and systems. His words stumbled over themselves, too polished to be sincere. Celeste let him finish. Not because she cared for the explanation, but because people reveal the most when they believe they're still in control. She stood silent as he fumbled through justifications. And then, with the calm precision of someone who has learned to weaponize composure, she opened her planner. Inside were notes, records, screenshots, timeline summaries. She had built this confrontation like an architect designing demolition. Meticulous, irreversible, strategic. She outlined the staff turnover data, highlighting how the diversity ratio had dropped by nearly 40% in less than 2 quarters. She referenced guest reviews with timestamps and photos, showing a pattern of neglect and cold service. She cited a resignation letter from a former sous chef who had flagged discriminatory behavior and been gaslit into quitting. All dismissed, all ignored. Jason's face tightened with every page. Still, she didn't yell. There was no need. She wasn't here to scold. She was here to execute. In a measured tone, she confirmed what had already been set in motion. HR had been notified. The compliance team was en route. Effective immediately, all on-site staff, including Jason and Brielle, were to be relieved of duty pending full investigation. Their system logins had already been disabled. Backup staff from nearby Haven hospitality locations were mobilized and would arrive within the hour. Operations would resume under emergency protocol. Jason said nothing then. There was nothing to say. The power he had clutched with casual carelessness had just been swept away like dust from a mantle. Celeste left him there. No threats, no lecture, just silence. As she re-entered the main dining room, a few guests turned to look, sensing the shift in energy. One woman whispered to her date, recognizing her from a Forbes profile. Another quietly pulled out her phone. Celeste didn't break stride. She moved through the room not as an executive taking revenge, but as a woman repossessing something sacred. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a correction, a course finally being righted. Outside, a second wave of rain had begun. It misted the pavement like the soft breath of renewal. A black SUV pulled up. From it emerged Haven's regional team, wearing branded jackets, clipboards in hand, professionalism radiating from their every step. They moved with purpose, quiet, respectful, efficient. Within minutes, the Violet Room became a new stage. The old cast was gone, and not a single word had been raised in their removal. Because true power doesn't scream. It arrives, it observes, and when necessary it rebuilds one table at a time. There's a certain kind of silence that follows a shift in power. Unnatural, heavy, like air waiting to be rewritten. That silence filled the Violet Room in the moments after Celeste Vaughn emerged from the private vestibule. It wasn't spoken. It was felt. Servers paused in motion, a tray of wine glasses slightly trembling in a waiter's hand. A bartender, halfway through polishing a coupe glass, stopped and set it down. Even the music, a Miles Davis ballad, seemed to lower itself in volume out of respect or fear. Celeste didn't need to declare what had happened behind closed doors. The atmosphere had already changed. It swept across the restaurant like a quiet tide. The general manager was gone. The hostess had disappeared from her post. And suddenly, the restaurant's elegant rhythm gave way to something unfamiliar. Accountability. She didn't smile. She didn't perform satisfaction. She simply moved with intention, every step a signature of authority. Not one based on hierarchy, but earned through vision, consistency, and a decade of building a legacy from the ground up. Back in the office, the cleanup had already begun. The head of regional operations, a woman named Marin, handpicked by Celeste years ago for her integrity, had arrived with a skeleton crew. Assistant managers, lead servers, kitchen support. These weren't interns or temps. These were trusted team members who had stepped into many crises before. Always quietly, always efficiently, always without ego. They were the kind of people who didn't flinch when systems failed or when leadership faltered. Tonight, they had arrived not just to restore service, but to help rebuild trust. The transition unfolded like a symphony of whispered instructions and purposeful footsteps. Staff badges were collected. Kitchen access was reassigned. Company tablets were locked down remotely. Within 30 minutes, the former staff had vacated the building. No shouting, no incident. Just the sound of reality settling into those who thought the mission didn't matter anymore. They'd been hired to protect an image. They forgot they were stewards of a story. Out front, guests still lingered. Some were confused. A few were irritated. but most sat quietly, unsure whether they were witnessing a disruption or a restoration. No formal announcement was made, but the shift in energy was unmistakable. Staff with new faces took over service. Welcoming, composed, gracious. Even the lighting seemed to change. What had felt like staged elegance an hour ago now pulsed with purpose. Celeste stepped back for a moment, watching from the side hallway. She saw one of the new servers, Derek, from the Oakland location, kneel to gently explain a menu change to an elderly guest. Another team member offered a warm towel to a mother whose toddler had spilled a drink. These were small moments, but they were the ones that mattered. Hospitality wasn't about theatrics. It was about attention. And for a while now, this place had been lacking it. In the kitchen, the temperature rose not just from heat, but from urgency. The new sous chef issued clear instructions. The team moved in practiced unison, blending seamlessly into the pulse of the restaurant. No shouting, no panic, just grace under pressure. That had always been the hallmark of Haven hospitality. Grace, even when people didn't deserve it. Celeste reflected on that word. What did grace look like when people had failed the very values they signed up to protect? Did it mean second chances? Did it mean measured consequences? Tonight, grace meant truth. It meant drawing a line. Because without consequences, values were just slogans printed on the wall. The regional HR lead quietly walked Celeste through the disciplinary process already in motion. Each former staff member would be interviewed, previous complaints re-examined, exit interviews reopened. No decision would be rushed, but tonight's firings were not temporary. They were structural. They were decisive. They were necessary. Celeste hadn't built Haven to become just another upscale hospitality group. She built it to rewrite the rules of who hospitality was for, who got to lead, who got to belong. What happened tonight didn't destroy her dream. It reminded her why it had to exist in the first place. Outside, rain had returned, brushing the city streets with rhythmic persistence. Back inside, the restaurant began to find its pulse again. The guests were eating. Conversations resumed. Candles flickered on each table like they had the night the place first opened, before it became a headline, before the metrics and milestones, before it started attracting people more interested in prestige than purpose. And somewhere in the back corner, a young couple raised their glasses, newly seated, having arrived just after the transition began. They hadn't seen the earlier events. To them, this was simply a beautiful restaurant with attentive staff and a soulful menu. In a way, that was the goal all along. For the mission to be invisible in its perfection. To simply feel right. Celeste stood near the glass doors, watching it all unfold. Not with relief, but with resolve. This wasn't the end of a crisis. It was the beginning of a reset. And yet, a part of her still ached. Because no leader wants to believe their vision can be corrupted. No founder wants to return to their flagship and feel like a stranger. But if tonight proved anything, it was that leadership is not a position, it's a responsibility. And when that responsibility is neglected, you don't just repair. You reclaim. Before she left, Celeste slipped a handwritten note to Marin. Every table is sacred. Every guest is seen. Never forget why we built this. Marin tucked it into her apron pocket, her eyes misting just slightly. And as Celeste stepped out into the night, the door closed behind her. Not on a broken dream, but on a chapter that had finally run its course. The Violet Room had been cleaned, not just in personnel but in purpose. And that kind of cleansing doesn't come with noise, comes with silence, with integrity, and with a leader who's unafraid to start over, no matter how successful things may appear on the surface. By the next morning, the Violet Room was no longer just a restaurant. It was a headline, a video clip, a conversation that echoed across digital spaces like a dropped glass in a quiet hall, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. The footage had come from a bystander. A grainy clip, filmed from the bar, showing a poised black woman calmly walking through the dining room as the hostess stand sat abandoned and the manager's office door closed behind her. There were no raised voices in the video, no dramatic confrontation. Only the slow, deliberate walk of someone who belonged. reclaiming a space that had momentarily forgotten her face. The video was 38 seconds long, but it told a story that resonated far beyond those seconds. Within hours, the caption began to circulate. CEO denied a table at her own restaurant, fires entire staff without saying a word. Some viewers clicked for the shock. Others stayed for the silence. Because in a world addicted to spectacle, the quiet dismantling of injustice struck a nerve. No yelling, no chaos, just a woman refusing to be diminished in a place she created. That kind of composure hit differently. It unsettled people because it reminded them that power doesn't always arrive with noise. It arrives with presence. News outlets caught on quickly. Local stations aired the story first, describing it as a stunning moment of corporate accountability. Then the national headlines followed. Business commentators dissected it. Culture critics analyzed it. Activists shared it. Suddenly, Celeste Vaughn became more than a CEO. She became a symbol. But she didn't see herself that way. In her apartment that morning, far from the buzz of the restaurant, she sat at her kitchen table in a soft robe, tea growing cold beside her laptop. Notifications came in relentlessly. Her name trended alongside hashtags about bias, leadership, and Black excellence. Friends texted links. Former colleagues sent emails with subject lines like, "So proud," and "You handled it with class." She didn't respond to any of them. She wasn't basking in vindication. She was reflecting on the quiet grief of betrayal, on the ache of knowing that your mission had been compromised under your own roof. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, respected maybe, but not relieved. Still, she knew the story now belonged to the world. She watched as think pieces popped up across LinkedIn, Medium, and Twitter. Commentators wrote about executive grace under pressure. Social justice threads unpacked the racial implications, how often Black women are disrespected unless their titles precede them, how systems can perpetuate harm even under banners of inclusion. There was praise, yes, but there was also backlash. Some critics claimed she'd overreacted, suggesting that staff should have been trained, not terminated. Others accused her of using her power to humiliate, not correct. They hadn't been there. They didn't know the data, the patterns, the ignored warnings. And Celeste knew women like her are always asked to be softer, gentler, nicer in their accountability. She was done asking for permission to be precise. Still, she didn't speak publicly. She declined interviews, turned down panel requests. When asked for comment, she released one sentence through Haven Hospitality's press office. "We are only as strong as the values we uphold when no one's watching." That was all she needed to say. Meanwhile, the Violet Room operated under new leadership. The emergency team she deployed remained in place, not just running the restaurant but recentering its soul. Staff gathered each morning for team reflections, sharing stories of what the mission meant, not just how to serve. Guests noticed the difference immediately. The service felt authentic again, not polished, present. The energy in the room had changed. One customer left a review that simply read, "It feels like Violet is back." Celeste read that and finally allowed herself to smile. But the ripple effects extended beyond her restaurant. Other businesses began re-examining their own service cultures. CEOs privately messaged her, confessing they'd been inspired to anonymously test their front lines. A large hotel chain reached out for consultation. A university requested permission to use the incident as a leadership case study. But what mattered most to Celeste was the quiet messages. DMs from young Black professionals who said, "Thank you for not staying quiet." Comments from women who had been dismissed in boardrooms, skipped over in line, mistaken for assistants, and told they didn't belong. They saw themselves in her walk through that restaurant. Not in defiance, but in dignity. It wasn't about vengeance. It never had been. It was about memory. Because when you build something from the ground up, when you pour your values into the brick, the wood, the lighting, the menu, you never expect that one day those values might be stripped out like wallpaper, covered up, ignored. But even the best foundations crack without care. Celeste's actions weren't born from pride. They were born from heartbreak. She had loved that restaurant, had named it after her grandmother, had envisioned it as a beacon of possibility. And when it failed its own mission, not just for her but for others, she had no choice but to burn away what was broken so something true could grow again. Later that week, she returned quietly to the Violet Room. No fanfare, no cameras. She sat alone near the window, finally, at a table. The same one the hostess claimed had been unavailable. A new server approached. Young, enthusiastic, respectful without being rehearsed. He welcomed her like he would any guest. She ordered her grandmother's favorite, tomato bisque, rosemary flatbread, and a glass of dry rose. It wasn't a victory meal. It was a homecoming. As she ate, she watched the restaurant hum around her. The laughter, the warmth, the easy grace that had once defined this place now pulsed in the air again. And she realized something profound. Sometimes you don't rebuild by tearing down. You rebuild by returning, quietly, firmly, unapologetically, to your seat at the table. Time passed as it always does, not in loud announcements, but in the subtle rhythm of change, in the soft murmur of evolving systems, in the still, deliberate breath of reflection. In the weeks that followed that quiet but seismic night at the Violet Room, the world moved on. News cycles spun toward new headlines. Viral clips were replaced by newer controversies. The social media storm that had once circled around Celeste Vaughn's actions began to settle into digital dust. But inside the walls of Haven Hospitality, and far beyond it, something had shifted. What Celeste did that night wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't even about the staff who had failed her, or the guests who watched. It was about something larger, something quieter, a line being drawn between what was acceptable and what was no longer tolerable. She hadn't planned for any of it to go public. She hadn't envisioned a viral moment. In truth, she had simply followed her instinct. A lifetime of knowing what silence had cost people like her had taught her one thing. Dignity was not passive. It had to be protected, defended, practiced, even in the smallest acts. Especially in the smallest acts. The Violet Room thrived in the months that followed. But not in the way that articles measured success. Not by reservation counts or gross margins, though those did rebound. It thrived in its spirit, revived, recentered. The staff who remained became stewards of something deeper. They carried the mission not as corporate lingo, but as lived conviction. New hires came from overlooked neighborhoods. Training sessions opened with stories, not slides. The restaurant didn't just serve meals. It became a place where community meant more than cuisine. The night Celeste returned to that table near the window, quiet, unnoticed, nourished by the food and the atmosphere she had resurrected, wasn't just a full-circle moment. It was a passing of the torch. Because this story, in the end, was never just about Celeste. It became about the conversations that rippled outward. The restaurant managers who questioned their hiring practices. The business owners who stopped relying on metrics alone and started listening to lived experience. It was about the college student who saw the video and wrote her thesis on bias in hospitality. About the former waitress who finally quit her toxic job and wrote to Celeste, saying, "You reminded me I deserve better." It was about the high school teacher in Georgia who showed the clip to her students and asked, "What would you do if this happened to you?" The story became something else entirely, no longer an incident, but a reminder that leadership isn't defined by how many people follow you, but by how you carry yourself when no one's supposed to be watching. That power, when held with integrity, can transform not just policy, but culture. In private, Celeste reflected often on her grandmother Violet. She could almost hear her voice, soft, southern, firm as iron when it needed to be, reminding her, "A kitchen can teach you a lot, baby. Teaches you who serves, and it teaches you who sees." Celeste had built the Violet Room as a tribute. But what happened that night had given the name new meaning. Because legacy isn't the thing you leave behind. It's the standard you insist on while you're still here. And the standard had been redefined. Eventually, the Violet Room would add another plaque to its entryway. Not for awards or critical acclaim, but to mark the moment that almost broke its mission. A reminder etched in brushed steel. Let every guest be seen. Let every table be sacred. In honor of the night, we remembered why we exist. Celeste didn't write the plaque herself. One of the new employees did. A junior hostess, barely 22, who said she wanted future staff to never forget what happened. Not out of fear, but out of purpose. Celeste saw it one day on her way in and said nothing. But her eyes lingered. It was then she understood. This legacy didn't need her name in lights. It needed her belief repeated again and again in small, consistent acts of courage. Across the country, small waves of change began to ripple. Other restaurants launched anonymous auditing programs. Diversity officers re-examined their checklists and asked better questions. Industry conferences started including panels on quiet bias and invisible gatekeeping, not because of outrage, but because of a moment that didn't shout and still spoke volumes. A moment where a black woman walked into her own restaurant, was denied a table, and decided that silence was not an option. She didn't retaliate. She restored. She didn't punish. She reset the compass. And in doing so, she reminded us that equity isn't just a policy, it's a posture, a decision, a standard you must fight to maintain, even when the world starts to forget. Even when you're the only one who remembers why it mattered in the first place. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the loudest. They're the ones that reclaim dignity without a single raised voice. If the story moved you, if you've ever been overlooked or underestimated, or if you believe that discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button to support stories that matter. Tell us if you ever had to reclaim your place. Your voice might inspire someone else to take theirs back. See you in the next story where silence ends and justice begins.